Killing, Intent, and the Collapse of the Trolley Dilemma, a conceptual analysis. The philosophical thought experiment commonly referred to as the trolley problem, or its transplant variance, has long been treated as a paradigmatic ethical dilemma, forcing an individual to weigh the life of one person against the survival of several others. Conventional interpretations frame the dilemma in terms of killing versus letting die, suggesting a moral tension between actively causing harm and passively allowing harm to occur. Upon careful reflection, however, I argue that the dilemma collapses conceptually once the proper role of intent is acknowledged. Killing, properly understood, is not a matter of causal contribution to death, but a judgment of intentionality, and therefore abstract dilemmas such as the trolley problem misrepresent the moral question. The problem of abstract moral distinctions. The typical formulation of the trolley problem presents the following scenario. A runaway trolley is about to strike 5 people on the track. One may pull a lever to redirect the trolley onto another track, where one person will die. The question is whether it is morally permissible or even obligatory to pull the lever. Philosophical discussion often emphasizes the perceived tension. Pulling the lever is killing one to save many, while refraining is letting 5 die. Yet this tension assumes the distinction between killing and letting die is meaningful in the abstract, where, in fact, without explicit intentionality, the distinction is conceptually trivial. Killing, by its moral definition, requires that a person intentionally deprives another of life. Without the intentional element, an action that causally results in death does not constitute killing. For example, if I accidentally stab somebody with a knife, there's no killing. If I fail to donate food that would prevent a person's death, there is not. If a banana peel causes a person to fall 2 days later, resulting in death, again, there is not. In all these cases, what matters morally is the agent's intent, not the mere causal contribution. Therefore, when the trolley problem asks whether one should pull the lever, the assumption that one is killing the single person is a misattribution. The death of that individual is an unintended consequence of an action aimed at preserving life, or just an accident. Intentionality and moral assessment. Recognizing that killing is defined by intent reshapes the entire analysis. Tripping the lever does not constitute the moral act of killing. The individual dies as a consequence of a life-preserving action. Not tripping the lever results in 5 deaths. Yet the causal responsibility for the death of the one individual on the diverted track in the first scenario is morally equivalent to the causal responsibility for the death of the 5 in the second scenario. The judgment of which action causes death more is therefore trivial and does not carry moral significance. This perspective aligns with the insight of G.E.M. Anscombe, who emphasized the role of intention in moral evaluation, arguing that ethical analysis that neglects the agent's intention risks misattributing moral responsibility. Similarly, Bernard Williams critiques simplified utilitarian frameworks that treat persons as interchangeable units, noting that they often abstract away from the human agency that is central to moral life. When intention is accounted for, the conceptual tension between doing harm and allowing harm dissolves, leaving only the axiom of preservation of human life as logically relevant. Outcome, causation, and the evaporation of the dilemma. Once we accept that pulling the lever is not killing in the intentional sense, the dilemma's moral weight shifts entirely to outcomes. In abstract terms, there are only two possibilities. 1. Pull the lever and 5 people live, and 1 dies. 2. Do not pull the lever, 1 person lives and 5 die. Here, the lever is not a weapon, and the act of pulling it does not constitute depriving someone of life intentionally. The individual who dies is the same in both scenarios as the result of circumstances beyond moral design, whether through action or inaction. Philosophically, the supposed tension between killing and letting die is therefore an artifact of misapplied moral terminology, and the only non-trivial principle that remains is the maximization of life preservation. In other words, the logical solution is unambiguous: pull the lever. The single negative outcome is morally insignificant because it is not an act of killing in the intentional sense. It is a consequence of an action aimed at preserving a greater number of lives. Conceptually, this resolves the dilemma. What appears to be a conflict between moral duties is, in fact, a misinterpretation of the moral category of killing itself. This analysis has profound implications. First, it demonstrates that abstract moral dilemmas often assume conceptual categories that do not withstand logical scrutiny. The killing versus letting die framing is not logically defensible without an appeal to arbitrary definitions of proximate causation. Second, it reaffirms the importance of intention in moral assessment. Actions that causally contribute to death do not automatically constitute killing, and ethical judgment cannot ignore the agent's mental state. Finally, it suggests that utilitarian reasoning, properly interpreted, is not morally controversial in such scenarios. It is logically necessary once the triviality of the killing distinction is recognized. Conclusion: the trolley dilemma, when subjected to a rigorous conceptual analysis, collapses. Killing is not a purely causal concept, but an intentional moral judgment, and in its absence, the distinction between doing harm and allowing harm is trivial. The lever is not a weapon. It is an instrument whose use preserves the maximum number of lives. Therefore, the only axiom that survives logical scrutiny is the preservation of human life, and the only rational response is to pull the lever. But removing the artificial tension of killing versus letting die, by removing the tension of killing versus letting die, we find that the moral landscape is simpler and clearer than the original dilemma suggests.